it's more like that we see that there's a higher trend, or like a general trend, that the ground truth values are higher, but definitely there has to be more work here to be done. Say that it is a concrete measure for cyber.
Okay. I have a question. Some of your techniques were velocity based, and you did that by using the gyros in the camera to extract the camera or to estimate the camera motion,
Right.
which obviously works well if you are capturing that data during the capture of the video. But for pre-captured videos that don't have that data, have you given any thought to applying that type of technique and extracting the scene motion from the actual video data through some sort of computer vision or image processing?
Yeah. We actually did. That's what we are doing right now. So this work is based on gyro data, but we're trying to extract features from videos, so movement, because, as you already say, not all videos have this movement data pre-recorded. So yeah, that's what we try right now, and we are pretty optimistic to have that done soon.
Okay, great. Um, let's see. I'm reading another question here. Farron Argulaget, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, says, nice talk. Regarding the occlusion on the peripheral area, I wonder if participants were distracted by it. Also, considering that it can vary a lot in a brief time, I wonder if it can become annoying. Just curious.
That's a fair question. I have to say, in the video, it looks more extreme than it is in the glasses. And because it's always moved with the eye gaze, it's actually not that distracting at all. There were even participants who not noticed this restrictor at all. So it's not that of a problem.
Okay. ECS Adonam says, regarding eye gaze data, you mentioned that for the eye gaze behavior, we found no significant change. What gaze metrics did you measure?
We measured the saccade velocity, so how fast, not how fast, how much the eye moves, and so basically the eye velocities we used as the measure for that.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. There's some more discussion in Discord, so feel free. There was a comment from that last speaker as well. So thanks everyone for all your questions, and let's thank all of our speakers again from this session.
Thanks, Evan.
Thanks. And now I have to say, I don't know how this happened, but this session was supposed to last until 6 p.m. Lisbon time, and it is 6:01, so we nailed it within 60 seconds. So we're going to take a 15-minute break now to get everyone just a time to get up and stretch your legs, so we don't just sit in front of Zoom all for hours and hours. We will resume with the second paper session in 15 minutes, so that will be at 6:15 p.m. Lisbon time. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, and I'm not sure how to change what's being presented there. Oh, there we go. It's just, they're just waiting for, okay, we've got I can't see the screen there. All right, so welcome to the second paper session in the workshop on immersive sickness prevention. Our first paper today is going to be on redirected tilting, and it will be presented by Tong Yu Ni. So Tong Yu, are you going to present live?
No, actually, I got my video recorded.
Okay, so Evan, you're going to have to help me with that because I'm not sure how to do that.
All right, I'm ready to start it right now.
Perfect, thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm Tong Yu Ni from the University of Minnesota. Today I am going to present my paper, Redirected Tilting, Eliciting Posture Changes with a Rotational Self-Motion Illusion. When you are skiing on ice or riding a bike, it is natural for you to take a banked turn if you are negotiating a corner. You will feel more balanced when part of the normal force is providing the centripetal force to keep you moving in a circle. What about if you are traveling along a curved trajectory inside VR? Without any vestibular feedback, users may start to experience cyber sickness. So, can we use banked turn in VR to mitigate cyber sickness? In this work, we proposed redirected tilting, a novel technique to mitigate cyber sickness when the users are traveling along a curved trajectory in the virtual environment. Redirected tilting involves rotating the virtual environment towards the turning direction around the headset's roll axis. With VR view tilting inward, this imitates the visual response of dragging the body to the rotation center using centripetal force. We hypothesized rotating the virtual environment could lead users to tilt their bodies in the same direction. As an initial exploration, we conducted a study to determine if it is possible to visually induce head tilt during virtual locomotion. We found redirected tilting successfully elicited head tilt, although the magnitude of rotation was smaller than our expectation. Previous techniques to mitigate cyber sickness are often motivated by minimizing sensory conflict. For example, dynamic field of view works by reducing the visibility of peripheral areas. Another example is the static and dynamic rest frames, which provide static objects for users so that they can use them as a stationary reference. Compared with existing techniques, redirected tilting is inspired by postural instability theory. What is postural stability? Postural stability is defined as a state where uncontrolled movements of the perception and action systems are minimized. According to this theory, prolonged exposure to postural instability will cause people to feel motion sickness. Redirected tilting focused on modifying system dynamics to elicit a more stable body pose. As I have mentioned before, a tilted body pose is more natural and balanced for users when they are turning. The major advantage of redirected tilting is that it won't reduce the visibility of the virtual environment. We conducted a user study to determine if manipulating the virtual environment towards the rotational center can elicit head tilt. We also want to evaluate the effect of different tilting parameters. The user study was a within-subject design. All the conditions were counterbalanced. As shown here, there were 5 conditions in this study. 4 experimental conditions were the combination of the 2 factors, tilting rate and max tilt angle. The 2 factors of redirected tilting each had 2 different levels. The lower tilt angle was 5 degrees, while greater tilt angle was 10 degrees. And for tilt rate, the slower tilt rate was 5 degrees per second, while the faster tilt rate was 10 degrees per second. And there was also a control condition without any redirection. During each trial, participants' task was to navigate around a 90-degree corner repeatedly. Each condition was repeated 10 times, 5 turning toward the left and 5 turning toward the right. The locomotion was automatic. Participants can only push the joystick forward to start moving. After that, the program controls their movement along a fixed path, and the virtual environment will tilt towards the turning direction when turning started, as shown in this video here. We recorded participants' head position and rotation during each frame. And here is an example of the recorded data from one trial. Y-axis is the degrees, while x-axis is the time order of each frame. The blue line is the redirection we applied. As you can see, the rotation of the virtual environment increased gradually until it reached a max angle, which is 5 degrees in this case. The orange curve is the recorded head roll rotation in degrees. For each trial, the elicited head tilt was calculated by averaging the head roll rotation during this 1-second window marked in the red box and subtracted to the rest head roll rotation as shown here in this green line. We evaluated the effectiveness of redirected tilting by calculating the gain of head tilt. The gain of head tilt is the elicited head tilt theta diff divided by the max tilt angle of the virtual environment. We have 3 hypotheses in this study. Hypothesis 1 is that all the experimental conditions can elicit head tilt towards the turning center. Hypotheses 2 and 3 are about the parameters. We hypothesize that slower tilt rate and larger max roll rotation will result in higher elicited tilt angle. Here are the average head tilt gain for all participants. The x-axis denotes all the participants ordered by their gain. and y-axis is the average head tilt gain of each participant. We can see that 6 participants were tilting outwards. Their head tilt gain was negative, and 21 participants tilted towards the turning direction as we expected. So we can divide the participants into 2 groups, tilting inward group and tilting outward group. This is an unexpected result. We believe 2 different groups represent qualitatively different responses to redirected tilting. And because the amount of participants in tilting inward group is fairly small, we could not statistically compare the head tilt between these 2 groups. For the tilting inward group, we conducted a Friedman test to compare the elicited head tilt between conditions. Post-hoc analysis showed that all experimental conditions elicited head tilt towards the turning center compared with the control group. As a result, hypothesis 1 was supported. On the other hand, tilt rate did not have significant impact on the elicited head tilt. Group LS and LF have no significant differences. So do GS and GF. So hypothesis 2 was not supported. However, there was significant difference between lower max tilt angle conditions and great max tilt angle conditions. Significant difference was found between LS and GS and between LF and GF. So hypothesis 3 was supported. So for this study, we found a minority of participants tilted their heads toward the opposite direction. Maybe the tilt rate was too fast. Further investigation is needed to see if changing parameters, like having a slower tilt rate, can reduce the number of participants who tilted oppositely. Also, we found that the posture sway was higher in the tilting outward group than tilting inward group. This result may suggest that tilting inward can help maintain body balance better. In conclusion, we proposed redirected tilting in this work. We also evaluated a few different tilting parameters. We found that redirected tilting can elicit tilting in the same direction for the majority of participants. For the next step, we plan to find the ideal movement parameters to maximize the gain of head tilt. After that, we will formally evaluate the effect of redirected tilting on cyber sickness. In the end, we would like to thank Courtney Hutton-Pospick for her assistance with the paper. We would also like to thank XRDRM for creating an online VR study platform during the pandemic. And this work is supported by the National Science Foundation. That's all, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tong Yu. That was a really, really interesting presentation. And we've got a few questions already posted to the Discord. So, so the first question is by Stephen Gilbert, and he was asking if you know how the curve should look in a real banking. I think Stephen, you might have been referring to the results curve. I don't know, Tong Yu, if you want to bring up that slide where you had the graph with the blue line that kind of went up and down in a step function, and then the one that showed how the head moved.
Oh yeah. So first of all, thanks Stephen for the question. Actually, the curve I have is I took it from the actual data. So yeah, this is a real banking curve, and for and the lagging time also exists based on our observation, because human response has the lagging time to the redirection. Yeah, so that hope it answers your question.
And I had a couple of questions. So my first question is, did your participants mention anything about noticing the tilt? And if they did mention about noticing the tilt, did it affect their subjective experience at all?
We didn't include this in this question in our studies questionnaire, but I did hear from a few participants after the study was over. So their response was, I believe a few participants noticed this, but they didn't mention any uncomfortable they have caused by tilting.
Okay. So Isias is asking that, considering that you did the study remotely and that there were many different types of devices that participants used, do you have any thoughts about whether there might have been some sensitivity to the hardware? That the hardware could have potentially led to some inter-participant differences.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So basically nowadays, we can only carry on research online because of the pandemic, and however, the difference caused by the differences across different devices I believe it still needs further investigation to determine that. I think, I think in this year's conference, we are seeing studies address this problem in their papers. I think one is coming from Iowa State. So yeah, I think there exists difference. However, this is something we cannot avoid because of the current situation. However, based on this study, I think the only difference is that might affect our result is the weight of the VR headset. And if the VR headset is super heavy, then it may affect people's tilting behavior. And that's the major difference. However, we admit this is a difficulty we are facing, but we cannot have too much to do with current situation. But in the future, maybe we can only recruit participants using one single headset, so to mitigate this effect. Yeah.
So thank you. So we've got like about a minute left for questions and many more questions. So I'm going to throw in a question that I had, and then that sort of segues into Stephen's second question, which is, can you say a little bit more about how you define the tilting as outward versus inward? Because, the tilting is sort of changing over time, and there was a little bit of a very subtle after effect that was shown in your slide where you showed the data of what people do with the head tilt. So was it the first direction of a tilt, or was it the cumulative average angle of head tilt? And then segueing from that, could you explain why some people tend to lean more outward versus inward?
So I think I got a few questions at the same time. So to address the first question, for the people who are tilting outward, the explanation is still unknown, because I have searched through the research, the literature in neuroscience and kinesiology. There's no conclusion on why this would happen. So it needs further investigation into this. And sorry, could you remind me of the second problem? A question?
No, the question was just how did you calculate it? Because they were presumably tilting, a lot, or the tilting was changing over time.
Oh, yeah. So I averaged out their head roll rotation over a window of 1 second. So I think it's averaged. And I also did not mention in my presentation, I used a head reset procedure between each trial to avoid people's head tilt lagging across different trials.
Okay, so there was well, we're sort of out of time. There was one more really interesting question though. The Fern was asking, were people moving or standing still when they were doing this? Were they stepping in place, or were they just standing and holding the controller?
Oh yeah, so during the study, all the participants were asked to stand still during throughout all the trials.
And they were standing, not sitting.
Yeah.
Okay.
All of them were standing during the study.
Okay, great. So, there's a lively discussion which you might want to look at on the Discord, but I think we're going to need, in the interest of time, to move on to our next paper presentation. So thank you, Tang Yu. Our second talk in the afternoon session is entitled CyberSense, a closed loop framework to detect cyber sickness severity and to adaptively apply reduction techniques. And the paper will be presented by Ritaful Islam. So,
hello, everyone. So my name is Rifatul Islam, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And I'm very excited today to share our work with you. The title of our work is CyberSense, a closed loop framework to detect cyber sickness severity and adaptively apply cyber sickness reduction techniques. So let's get started. And before we actually move into the details of our paper, I just want to quickly go over the conventional approach of cyber sickness detection and reduction. So typically we run user studies, and then we collect subjective questionnaires after the end of the user study. And then again, we apply some reduction techniques, and then again, do the subjective questionnaires. And finally, we compare the results from these subjective questionnaires, like these similar sickness questionnaires, and then find out whether the reduction technique was successful or not, and things like that. Now, what is the problem of this particular approach? The first problem that you would see that we are only detecting cyber sickness severity after the end of the simulation. So that doesn't give us sufficient granular understanding what is happening during the VR simulation. And it is likely that during that VR simulation, there are some point in times where the severity was much higher than the other. So we don't know that. And since we don't know that, we cannot adaptively apply the reduction technique. So there's no adaptation possible with the reduction technique. And also, the whole process is not automated. So it requires human interventions to collect the subjective data and also process the data and come up with the results. Now, what is going to be the solution to that conventional approach? The first solution that we need is we need an automatic cyber sickness detection. We need also automatic cyber sickness reduction. We would also need automatic adaptation of this cyber sickness reduction technique based on the current state of the cyber sickness. And the whole system has to be closed loop in nature so that we can basically integrate that into a framework. So we propose CyberSense framework that basically get rid of all those different limitations. So as you can see, once the user put on the headset, then the VR application sends periodic requests to the server, And the server then essentially collects some data using some sensor API. Those data can either be some physiological data, motion data, eye tracking data that is related to cyber sickness, and then it send it back to the server. The server then processes those data and applies some intelligence on the data to basically get the current state of the cyber sickness. And then it send it back to the rendering toolkit, where the rendering toolkit basically apply some changes and adaptively apply those changes based on the onset of cyber sickness that is predicted by the server, and then render the changes to the simulation. So this is basically the overview of the cyber sickness architecture. So now how does it solve that problem? So it has three major features in it. So it can do automatic detection, it can do automatic reduction, and it can also adapt the reduction technique based on the current state of the cyber sickness. So it is not limited by those limitations that we have in the conventional approach. Now, this is the full architecture of the CyberSense. And as you can see, it has three major components. The first one is the CyberSense client API. The second one is the server API, and the third one is the brain API. So let's go a little bit more details into that. So first, we're going to talk about client API. It has the network components. Basically, it sends TCP connection requests and other requests to the server. And then we have the request manager that determines how frequently we would need the prediction from the server. And then we also have the rendering toolkit in here that renders the changes to the VR simulation, and it does that adaptively based on the current state of the cyber sickness. And you also have the sensor API that collects some data from the user. It can be either be some physiological data, it can be eye tracking data coming from the headset, head orientation data, head tracking data, all these different types of data that actually is related to cyber sickness. Now, the important components in here are the sensor API and the rendering toolkit. The sensor API, as I already mentioned, that it can be configured to basically take any types of data. And based on the application and the data availability, it can be configured according to that. The rendering toolkit, on the other hand, it applies changes adaptively, and how it's going to apply those changes and which cyber sickness reduction technique it is going to be using, it can be configured also. So for this particular work, we actually use the Gaussian blur cyber sickness reduction technique and also the dynamic field of view cyber sickness reduction technique. So in figure 3A, you can see that this is the actual simulation, actual roller coaster simulation that we used. On figure 3B, this is the Gaussian blurred version of the same simulation. And 3C is the dynamic field of view applied on the same thing. All these two approach, the Gaussian blur and the dynamic approach, they can be configured to apply adaptively during the simulation. So if the cyber sickness intensity is going higher, the intensity of the Gaussian blur will follow that accordingly. And also the same is true for the dynamic field of view. Now, any other framework other than this two approach, any other reduction technique approach can be applied within this framework. Okay, so now let's move on to the CyberSense server and the brain. The server actually integrates basic to operation. It takes the request from the client and it collects the data from the sensor API. The brain, on the other hand, it has a data processor. Based on the nature of the data, it will actually process those data and then apply some neural network on those data to predict the onset of cyber sickness. Now, in order to evaluate the CyberSense model in here, we actually use two different approaches. The first one, we evaluated the model performance on different request interval and different types of data load. And the second one is we evaluated the performance of the prediction. And we also used a defined data set that is available online. That is basically some physiological data set, including heart rate and galvanic skin response that is related to cyber sickness. Now, in order to test the performance of the CyberSense, we actually run it on different iteration with different configurations. So request interval from 1 second to all the way to 120 seconds, and with different type of data loads, meaning that 60 data per seconds in here to all the way to 3,560 data samples per second in number 9 iteration. And the worst case scenario was number 9, where we are requesting on each second with 3,500 data samples. And the average time to complete that particular request and basically render all the changes to the server was 7.12 seconds. Now, this is the test result for the validation sets. From validation 1 to 5, we have number of trained sample, test samples, and the test root mean square in here. And this is a visual representation of those validation state. As you can see, the blue one is the actually reported cyber sickness intensity by the participant or the ground truth in this case. The red one is the predicted one. The trained of those predicted value almost similar, but in some cases it actually struggled to predict the value. For example, in this particular case, the actual value of the cyber sickness severity was 6, more than 6 actually, and where it was reported actually by the neural network was 2 point something. So that was a huge error in there. In the other validation set, you can also see that in some cases it actually struggled, but in some cases they were like following the trends. Now, this is also an illustration for a particular individual. On the x-axis, we have the number of minutes that was passed in the virtual reality, and on the y-axis, we have the reported feedback from the participant or the intensity of the cyber sickness. The blue one is the ground truth, and the red one is the predicted value. In here also, you can see the predicted value follows the similar trend according to the actual value, but there was a lot of error in here. In some cases, there was like exactly the opposite trend. Now, the limitation, of course, is we're not able to validate the study with a new zero study because of the pandemic that is going on worldwide. Also, the prediction root mean square is very high. And we actually figured out why that error was so high. So when we actually see the distribution of the data that we got from the previous studies is on the x-axis, we have the verbal feedback or the ground truth of the cyber sickness severity, and on the y-axis, we have the number of samples. So as you can see, this is not uniformly distributed, meaning that we have a lot of example of intensity 3.0 in here, where we have very less example on intensity 9. So the neural network actually struggled through that. Now, to conclude and to guide towards the future research scopes, we actually were able to automatically detect cyber sickness based on the data set that we have available right now. We also did the automatic adaptation of the reduction techniques based on the current severity. And the system was closed loop. So once the model is trained, there is no need for any kind of human interventions. Now, this similar type of application or framework can be used for any type of adaptive VR application other than cyber sickness. So for example, for adaptive VR rehabilitation, we can use CyberSense to basically change the VR simulation according to the physical intensity or the current physical load of the users. So it can be adaptively change the difficulty level based on that. So that's all. I'd like to thank you all for listening. And I would also like to thank to our partners, NSF and Intel, for supporting us with this project. And I would love to answer your questions. If you have any, please let me know. And thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for that talk. Really, really interesting. I mean, this just seems like the most powerful and perfect system that everyone wants to have, to be able to detect cyber sickness online and to be able to respond to it adaptively. While we wait for people to, I can see there's a number of folks typing into the Discord right now. But while we wait for those questions to come in, I was wondering if you could. I think you probably said this at the beginning of your talk, but if you could restate it, how again did you automatically detect the onset of cyber sickness? You had a bunch of different measures that you were the physiological measures and so on. Did you also use something like I think you said you also used some subjective measures when you were training your model?
Yeah. So for the training purposes, we'll need that subjective measure in order to train the model and construct the ground truth. So the data set that we used that already had the label data associated with the physiological response. So they have like heart rate, galvanic skin response data collected during the VR simulation, and verbal feedback ground truth was collected on each minutes of interval. So they had that ground truth for that data set. So we use that ground truth to basically train the neural network. And of course, other than those physiological data, if someone choose to use eye tracking data or any kind of head tracking data or the visual data coming from the headset, that can be also used. So the framework is there. The way the researcher need to utilize different part of the system, they can configure it according to their data set available at that time.
And so did each individual need their own model? Or was it trained on a population
Yeah,
level?
that would be super nice if we can like personalize the whole thing and individualize the whole thing. That would be super nice. But from the perspective of the data set that we have right now, it would be really hard. But one thing I can, that is actually an excellent question. One thing I can answer to that towards like future direction of the research is like, of course, we can use the pre-trained model, and then using some transfer learning technique in the deep neural network, we can basically tune the network to basically personalize for individual based on their, like, as soon as the individual is experiencing more and more research, more and more VR simulation, we can actually capture those data and then tune in the neural network to basically individualize the system for that particular individual.
Yeah, because I was wondering if some of the weights in the network might not be different for different people, like, just because you have all the, you have the postural sway, and then you have the
Yeah.
galvanic skin response, and then, for some people, they might manifest with, GSR, but others might manifest with,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay.
I agree with that completely. Yeah.
So, so let's see, we have a couple of questions. There was a question from Yu Yang Wang, who was asking about the errors in the model, and what you think are the primary factors in the errors. Do you think it's individual differences, or do you think it's that you just need a bigger training set, or are there like missing inputs, or
Yeah, we need a good data set. I would say like this data set has its own limitation. Like when the like we did a regression analysis. So when you are doing the regression analysis using the neural network, you see that there's a, at the very last of the presentation, I talked about like the data set was not uniformly distributed. So there are like less example of some particular severity of the cyber sickness compared to the other one. So the neural network was more biased to that example that it has more compared to it has actually less. So it actually struggles. So we need a good data set. Of course, we need to tune in the model. We can work do a different work only just to tune in the model. We just did a simple regression with the LSTM network, and there's a lot of paper, actually, recent works that can be configured and installed within this framework to basically predict it more accurately. So that's a different work. So yeah, we can do a lot of things basically to improve the performance of the neural network, reducing the error with different data sets, and it can be tuned in different, like we can also do multimodal training, things like that. So it is a different research. The research that I was focused in is like just to like proposing this closed loop framework that can adaptively change the intensity of the reduction techniques. Yeah, and that's a really good question. Yeah, thank you.
So we're a minute over time, but there's a great question from Isius that I thought, if you could answer really quickly. And
Yeah.
This is a question about the timing of the physiological responses, because I know that for some of them, say like postural sway it precedes the cyber sickness, but other things like say gastro or whatever might you might notice them after the sickness onset. How do you how does that timing
Yeah,
work?
I think that is an excellent question. And from our investigation and some previous research, it would take around 3 to 5 seconds based on some previous research to see any significant changes in the physiological data, meaning either their heart rate data or the galvanic response data. So the way we actually configured it, like when we use 60 seconds of data or in a single point in time, when you say that the request interval is 60 seconds, that means it will look back into the previous 60 seconds of consecutive data window to predict the next value. So there's a caveat in here, like for the first minute, if we configure it to 60 seconds, for the first minute, you'll not get any prediction because the network is trying to get those data. Starting from the second minute, it has those 60 seconds data, then it can look back to the previous 60 seconds of data and then predict the next one. Then for the next minute, it can also look back to the 60 seconds of data and then predict the next one. So this is how we actually configured it. But of course, you can change this parameter to like do anything else.
Okay, yeah. So then I guess then the other question is, if some of the measures only happen after someone gets sick, they people might already be like a little bit sick by the time their GSR would go up.
Yeah. And I honestly don't know any like really, other than probably EEG signal. All those different type of like physiological signals has its own limitation. So we can also like use different type of input modalities like eye tracking, head tracking, or EEG even if it is configured in real time. So we can use different type of data to see which one has the faster reaction time. But that is actually a limitation to the data set itself.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much. Really stimulating talk.
Thank you.
So we need to move on quickly to the last talk in our session, which is a presentation by Daniel Zalasko, a self-report of virtual reality induced sickness. And I don't know, Daniel, if Daniel's here or if you're going to show the video.
I'll play the video. Daniel is double booked in another workshop, but he said he's going to switch over.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Zilasko, and with this talk, I want to give a detailed report on the experiences of an individual with cyber sickness. So, what is the rationale or the motivation of this talk? It is 2021, and fortunately, there's a common knowledge that cyber sickness as a form of motion sickness exists and is bad. Further, we tend to say that there is also consensus in cybersickness being an actual problem that should or has to be addressed. And while I'm sure this consensus is reached in the workshop, because otherwise you maybe would have not attended, things start to get crumbly already at this point. Yes, the minority of today's VR games includes continuous virtual travel, and there are comfort options in nearly everyone. But then there are these moments where the CEO of a big company states in public that cybersickness is a solved problem and people will get used to it. Or a colleague states that we know how to avoid cybersickness, just stop continuously moving and that's it. I am not sure how you feel about this, but I want to move continuously in VR. So at the end, we are not sure about the consensus for this point. When it comes to cybersickness being a complex, not easy explainable phenomenon, things get worse. I don't want to state that many researchers, collaborators and developers are not aware of this. No, we think they are. But results are often misread or effects overestimated, and we named already a prominent example. Yes, there is evidence that some people habituate to VR experiences. But by far not everybody does, and the problem persists. With this talk, we want to create awareness how cybersickness can feel for the individual. We have found someone that is very sensitive to cybersickness, but still is confronted with it on an almost daily basis. He wants to share his experiences. We will keep him anonymous through the course of this talk and refer to him as Mark. At this point, we have to interrupt for a disclaimer. We are reporting about one individual. This work does neither contain new findings regarding cybersickness nor wants to postulate them. Instead, we want to create awareness and want to give insights into the daily life with cybersickness. That being said, let's have a closer look on Mark. Mark is 35 years old and male. He is 1.85 meter tall, left-handed and overweight. His IPD was measured 67 millimeters. He was always doing a lot of sports. Today there's only left swimming and hiking, and his fitness level thus has decreased in recent years. Let's not talk about COVID times. So let's do some cross-checks with literature. Mark is middle-aged and a grandpa when it comes to the regular study population. Age is often related with a negative impact on sickness vulnerability, but then there are sources stating that people get even immune with age, so results are mixed. Mark maybe got lucky regarding his gender. Would he be even more vulnerable as a female? There is some evidence for this, but the reasons are part of speculation. His overweight and decreasing fitness level might be a negative factor when it comes to sickness vulnerability. Let's have a look on Mark's medical history if there's anything of interest. And there's not too much. In primary school he suffered from heterophoria, which was cured by therapy. Also in primary school he suffered from stress-related migraine. Today there are no obvious artifacts left. He is healthy, takes no form of medication or therapy. There are no visual impairments. Anyways, Mark shows strong body reactions under stress, which are related to the ones he's showing when he's cybersick. We will talk about that later. His motion sickness susceptibility score, though, is 0. In his family, also his sister is hypersensitive to cybersickness, while his mother is not. Cross-checking tells us that there are indeed connections found between migraine and motion sickness, but Mark does not suffer from any form of it today. Very interesting is that he's not suffering from any other form of motion sickness. Thus his MSSQ score is being 0, where this is one of the strongest predictors for sickness vulnerability. Let's have a look on user experience next. Mark faces computer screens up to 15 hours a day, working and gaming. He uses VR devices for more than 7 years now, including caves, stereo displays and HMDs. Before this time there were sporadical uses and he does not remember to got sick back then. However, maybe he just was not aware of the existence of cybersickness or applications were sickness-friendly. Again, cross-checking with literature, gaming experience seems to be a good thing regarding sickness vulnerability. Not so for Mark. In the introduction, we already grabbed habituation. There is habituation to sickness found in literature, most of the time from novice to non-novice users. What is often not discussed in literature, however, are possible reasons. We think this is in particular important as our own observations showed that people get also used to experience by not taking part any longer, avoiding sickening situations, or changing behavior such as closing their eyes while turning. This all is not meant by habituation but potentially measured as such. For Mark, it only got worse with time, which negatively correlates with experience but more likely comes down to age or fitness level. Let's go to the maybe most interesting part. When does Mark get sick? This almost exclusively happens in presence of virtual rotation, but not always. There are rare instances where applications make heavy use of virtual rotation and Mark is not affected by any sickness symptoms. These instances are unfortunately not reproducible. Mark also performs VR gaming, usually standing, without any issues, but as already referred to in the introduction, the majority of games avoid continuous virtual movements by design. Mark is developing continuous and semi-continuous locomotion interfaces. When developing and testing, and this happens often multiple times a week, there are always moderate to severe instances of cybersickness symptoms at some point. Where moderate means he stops using VR for that day but can continue working, and severe means he has to lay down and rest for at least 30 minutes. Some symptoms then last at least for the rest of the day. One reason for the often strong instances of sickness, of course, is based on the nature of his experiences. He is developing these interfaces, which means that they are often not adult or broken. Further, Mark describes the instances of sickness more raising event-based than continuously increasing. Often it is even one single knockout event caused, for instance, by an unexpected and heavy rotation. While he would say that the instances of sickness are more regular and severe when using HMDs, there were also instances of severe sickness in caves. The differences could already be based on the fact that there are less virtual rotations required in a cave. Finally, Mark rarely experienced similar symptoms when watching other people playing fast games or more recently when monitoring participants taking part in a VR experiment. Something interesting here is that sitting has shown to have a positive impact on sickness vulnerability, and our own observations confirm this. Mark's case, however, nicely illustrates that sitting people still get sick, and depending on other factors, they can even get more sick than in a standing condition. This is one of the misunderstandings that we often hear. Effects are overestimated. Regarding Mark's sickness experiences outside of VR, it is just hard to say if they are related or based on conditioning, for example. How do Mark's symptoms look like? So this is actually the most difficult part. Grabbing and describing the symptoms can be difficult when neither being an expert to medicine nor being trained for it, and when being always sick. He first tried to describe it with other situations. He was never poisoned, but this is how he would imagine it feels like. It is as would your whole circulatory system shut down, or you're feeling weak, powerless, comparable to a flu. The symptoms always already start after seconds or minutes after exposure and can last for days. Mark tried to record his feelings more systematically, thus answered simulator sickness questionnaires and did audio recordings. The results of this endeavor you can find summed up here. What you see are the 16 symptoms listed in the SSQ plus 2 additional ones. Their occurrence is given for the moderate and the severe instances of sickness we were talking about before. Dark blue circles indicate symptoms that do occur always, and light blue circles symptoms that do occur sometimes. Their radius indicates the strength of the symptom. We do not have the time to discuss every aspect here. Please refer to the paper or me afterwards for this. Anyways, there are some interesting things we want to discuss here. First, at the end it was possible for Mark to find almost every of his symptoms in this questionnaire, which he is using for years now, but it took him enormous effort, self-reflection and thinking to do so. What does this mean for participants? Some of the symptoms never occur for Mark, such as nausea and increased salivation. As you might have already discovered, Mark wanted us to add 2 more symptoms. The first is coughing. This always occurs together with the single heavy knockout events we talked about before. Other symptoms might be delayed, but when he has to cough, he already knows that this will end up in bed very soon. The second is yawning. This sometimes occurs with less severe instances of sickness, but also is a good sign to quit. The last thing we want to mark here is the delay of symptoms. Not only that symptoms are usually delayed and increase after exposure for Mark, but that the symptoms can be categorized by their immediacy. So coughing is something that always is closely related in time to the knockout event, while headache and eye strain are starting minutes later. When it comes to treatment and recovery, we are done quickly. To recover, Mark does lay down for at least 30 minutes. He tries to have some fresh air and some slightly sugared drink. When appetite comes back, eating seems to help a lot. He never did big experiments, did not try ginger or drugs, as they usually only fight symptoms. Mark tried a lot when it comes to system factors and methods that have the aim to prevent or counter cybersickness. We already talked multiple times about sitting, and we are currently investigating this in a user study that is on ice because of COVID-19. There is field of view modification, the inclusion of a reference frame, embodied locomotion, and semi-continuous locomotion, where we actually have a paper on in the locomotion workshop at VR next Friday. He tried all these, some of them in combination, and the bad news is he is still getting sick. The good news, however, is he thinks they all have a positive effect, and he might be a hopeless case where others might be not. Which already brings us to the conclusion of this talk. We have monitored a few hundred participants during VR studies, and none has ever shown symptoms that were comparable in strength with Mark's, with one exception, his sister. Mark is special, and it is unclear whether his experiences can be of special interest because of this, or completely uninteresting because he is just a special case. But we do not have to answer this question, because this report mainly had another purpose, and for this it serves as good as any other. Mark's experiences and history in many parts are in line with current findings and expectations, while they contradict to others. We claim that this is the case for most people that are vulnerable to cybersickness, and that there is not a simple pattern. Mark's vulnerability to stress might be another starting point for further investigations, but we can already say that this again will not deliver this one simple answer. There are too many people suffering from cybersickness being completely different. Counters and preventions show effects, but people, not only Mark, still get sick. Finally, a life and work with cybersickness is possible, but not worth striving for. With these words, I want to thank you for your attention. If you have answers, want to discuss, want to subject Mark, or have an opinion, contact me.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It was a very interesting presentation. We're unfortunately right at our ending time of 1:15, but Tong, you had a question which I think if you're here to be able to answer would be great. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned physical fitness and age. Can you say anything about Mark's balance ability? Has that changed at all over the past years?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I'm not sure. So, which might be an indication for that not, so that it's not changed. So not that it came to any special visibility. But it might be worth trying it at least and check if there's something changing.
Okay, well, and then I had a question. I think you might have already addressed it. It was when he was asking. Mark made note of activities. Has Mark made note of activities that he did before trying out an experience? I think you mentioned something about how suddenly everything would be fine, and then there would be like a catastrophic event. But did Mark notice any sort of did any pattern emerge of activities before trying an experience that might have led to cyber sickness?
Unfortunately, nothing obvious. So usually the biggest dividing factor between getting sick or not getting sick is really the continuous movement, and he's usually almost and every time getting sick when there is continuous movement. There's only really super rare cases where this is not the case. Those might be interesting because they're indicating that there's something as daily, maybe he was good at that day, or there is another factor, and it might be interesting to find that out. But these cases are so rarely happening that it's difficult to really catch them.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to be sensitive to people's need for a break before our next session. So we will see you all back in about 12 minutes for the keynote, actually capstone, I guess, talk by Stephen Palmisano. So have a nice break and see you in 12 minutes. we back on live now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So I would like to welcome everyone back to the workshop on immersive sickness prevention and to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Our keynote talk is entitled, "Why Do We Get Sick During HMD-Based Virtual Reality?" And our keynote speaker is Dr. Stephen Palmisano. So Dr. Palmisano is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Wollongong. And I'm very grateful to him for being willing to be with us here now. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning his time, 6 o'clock maybe, I don't know, it's way too early, whatever it is. So Dr. Palmisano has been interested in visual simulation, illusions of self-motion, called Vection, motion sickness since 1992, when he completed his undergraduate honors thesis on the perception of self-motion in central and peripheral vision. Subsequently, he completed his PhD on perceiving self-motion in depth at the University of New South Wales under Professor Barbara Gillam. And then after that, he was a postdoctoral fellow with Professor Ian Howard on vection and stereopsis at York University in Canada, then returned to Australia in 2000 to build his own perception and action laboratory. So Dr. Palmisano's research disproves several common assumptions about self-motion perception. It reveals the importance of previously overlooked visual consequences of self-motion, and it's produced new physiological measures of vection or self-motion perception based on eye movements, postural activity, EEG, and fMRI. So more recently, Dr. Palmisano's research has focused on the user experiences of vection, presence, and motion sickness during HMD-based virtual reality. And in particular, while modern head-mounted displays provide new and exciting opportunities, cyber sickness remains a major hurdle to the success of this technology, as you all know, having been to heard the talks this morning. So Stephen is interested, therefore, in identifying the most provocative conditions for cyber sickness and the users who are most likely to suffer from it. So thank you again, Stephen, very much for being here, and really look forward to your talk.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Victoria and Evan, for inviting me. To some extent, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted, which is great. Having listened to the talks this morning, I don't think there'll be too much controversy. My background obviously is in vection, and so visually induced illusions of self-motion is what I've spent most of my career on. I don't think they're necessarily as provocative as some people believe. And also, I have quite a lot of experience in psychophysiological measures, and we've been struggling with them in psychology for quite a while. So subjective measures are always going to be around, I'm afraid. It's the question of how we mix and match our objective measures to go along with that. So I'll start my talk. I'm aware that some of the things I'm going to say have already been said in the session thus far. So forgive me, I'll try and gloss over those bits as quickly as I can. And I'll give you a bit of an overview of the research that I've been doing in the area of cyber sickness since I've made that pivot. And in fact, there is some older cyber sickness research that I have done with some colleagues, including Fred Bonato, but I'm going to ignore that research because the HMD technology was rather less sophisticated than it is now. Okay, so why do we get sick in HMD-based virtual reality? It's a bit of an ambitious title. So anyone who's tried virtual reality using the latest head-mounted displays cannot help but be impressed by their potential. HMD apps have now been created for a wide variety of vocational, educational, and recreational purposes, but there are still serious challenges associated with their use. Whenever you want to move your head or navigate through a virtual environment, you risk becoming cyber sick. And we know now that this sickness with HMDs appears to be more common than the sickness experienced when playing the same game on a desktop monitor or on a TV. And I won't go through the symptoms of cyber sickness because we've already had that done quite successfully already this morning. So what's my talk going to include today? Well, it's going to include what led us to propose a new approach for studying cyber sickness in HMD VR. It'll also cover my past successes and failures studying cyber sickness using existing theories of motion sickness. It will outline our new DVP hypothesis for cyber sickness in HMDVR. It'll provide some empirical support for this hypothesis, and it'll attempt to relate the hypothesis to other motion sickness theories and other well-known findings. And then I'll conclude with some suggestions for future DVP-based research. Okay, I'll start off by talking about sensory conflict theories of motion sickness. Now, we've already covered that a number of times earlier this morning, but I just want to put my mark on it if I can. So sensory conflict theories are a group of theories. Basically, these theories propose that sickness occurs when signals from our motion sensors or orientation sensors disagree either with each other or with what is expected based on past experience. And in particular, I'm going to talk about two different versions of these theories. There are other versions, I believe, but I'm going to talk particularly about the sensory rearrangement theory by Reason and the vection conflict theory by Hettinger and colleagues. Okay, sensory rearrangement theory is where sickness only occurs when there's a discrepancy between the currently sensed and expected patterns of motion stimulation. That is, there's a neural mismatch. And the prediction, or one of the main predictions of sensory rearrangement theory, is that sickness will decrease with repeated exposure to an initially provocative stimulus. Conversely, we've got vection conflict theory, which is all about simulator sickness and cyber sickness in HMDVR. And it proposes that those types of sickness will only occur when we experience illusions of self-motion, that is vection. And it predicts that sickness severity should increase with the vection strength. So what I'm going to do first up is talk about 5 studies which I did to test the predictions of sensory conflict theories in HMDVR. And we'll see how they go. Now, the first of these studies is Parmesan, Merzick and Kim, 2017. And this study, subjects made continuous yaw head movements while viewing simulated forward self-motion displays. So we've got me here with my HMD on, making continuous oscillatory yaw head rotation. So I'm rotating my head, attempting to rotate it just about the vertical axis. Now, I've got some conditions where I'm compensating for that yaw head motion, and I've got other conditions where I'm not compensating for that head motion. So in both of these cases, the optic flow is simulating forward self-motion. Sorry, the displays are so dim. So in both cases, we're simulating forward self-motion. In some conditions, we're actually compensating for the head movements that are being made while viewing that optic flow. In other conditions, we're just seeing the optic flow. Now, when the compensation occurs, it can either occur in the correct direction or in the inverse direction. So we're either getting ecological head compensation, so I move my head to the right, the display moves to the left, or I'm getting the opposite of that. So I'm getting a conflict situation where I move my head to the right and the display also moves to the right instead of going in the other direction. So we're trying to mess with the conflict. We're trying to experimentally manipulate the conflict in this study. Now, we're also trying to test the vection conflict hypothesis, as well as other sensory conflict theories by measuring vection. So in this particular study, we found that vection was strongest in the ecological condition and weakest in the inverse compensation conditions. However, we found that cyber sickness was most severe in the inverse compensation condition. So while this might support some sensory conflict theories, it doesn't appear to support the vection conflict theory because the stronger the vection, the weaker the cyber sickness. The weaker the cyber sickness, the stronger the vection in this particular case. So the next study I want to talk about is very similar to the study I talked about before, Archioni et al. 2019. In this study, subjects again made continuous oscillatory yaw head movements while viewing simulated forward self-motion displays, which either had ecological compensation, that is the display moved in the correct direction when you moved your head, or inverse compensation, it moved in the wrong opposite direction. Now, contrary to sensory conflict theories in this particular study, we found that sickness was similar for both the ecological and inverse compensation conditions. And we didn't measure vection in this study because we were also looking at postural sway. So we don't know what the vection was in this study, but we do know that, the results were not consistent with general sensory conflict theories because a low conflict and a high conflict condition produced very similar sickness. And in fact, despite the fact that the conditions were very similar to the previous study, we actually got a lot less sickness in this study than the Parmesan, Merzick and Kim study. And we believe it was due to the fact that we had these head-fixed stationary fixation points included in the display in this experiment. So that may serve as a useful countermeasure, and it's obviously very cheap and easy to implement. Now, the third study I want to talk about in terms of sensory conflict theories is looking at different methods of virtual locomotion and how they relate to sickness. So in this particular study by Clifton and Parmesano, we had subjects move through a virtual outdoor environment, either by point walking or teleporting. So on one day, they would move through the environment only by point walking, and on the other day, they'd move through the environment only by teleporting. There'd be 16 minutes of them doing this continuously on either day with 24 hours between each exposure. And of course, half the subjects had teleporting on day one, half the subjects had point walking on day one. Now, the issue with point walking is that you've got global optical flow, and global optical flow, particularly presented in an HMD, will produce a visually induced illusion of self-motion. Over here with teleporting, you're at point A at time 1 and you're at point B at time 2, and there's no flow between those two conditions. So this is a very powerful vection manipulation. So according to sensory conflict theories, point walking should be more likely to induce vection and cause cyber sickness because it's got this global visual motion. However, what we found that was interesting was of the 25 participants that we tested in this study, 9 of them actually got more sickness when continuously teleporting. So we refer to these people as telesick individuals as opposed to point sick individuals. However, in general, consistent with the vection conflict hypothesis, we did find that there was a significant positive relationship between vection strength and cyber sickness severity. However, I should note that that's a very strong vection manipulation in this study and maybe a rather artifactual one. For study 4, we're looking at dynamic field of view restriction and cyber sickness. I don't really need to explain field of view restriction because we've covered that before, but we've got conditions where there's field of view restriction that occurs when we're simulated to be moving, and conditions where we've got a full field of view for the entire time. Tixera and Parmesano had participants play this Marvel Powers United video game as they would normally play, in this case as Spider-Man, so point walking and teleporting, either with this field of view restriction on or off. And as expected, we found dynamic field of view restriction significantly reduced the severity of the cyber sickness that was experienced. However, you'll notice that while the effect is significant, it's not huge. So we had a p-value of 0.045, so it just sort of got over the line. So obviously it helps, it's useful, but it's no magic bullet. Contrary to the vection conflict hypothesis, in this particular study, vection strength was not significantly related to cyber sickness severity. Now, the last of these 5 studies I want to talk about in terms of testing sensory conflict theories is this one that we haven't yet quite published, which is testing one of the main predictions of sensory rearrangement theory. That is that repeated exposure to HMD-VR should gradually reduce neural mismatch and decrease cyber sickness. What we were wondering was how similar might these VR exposures need to be to receive such benefits. So we used 2 HMD VR apps, this Summer Funland roller coaster and this Summer Funland lighthouse climb, where you're actually physically climbing the tower as well as doing it in virtual reality. So we had 2 groups of 14 subjects, and they were given different amounts of exposure to these 2 different games. And importantly, none of these 28 subjects had experienced HMD VR before. So this is basically the layout of this study. We've got group 1 and group 2. Group 1 on day 1 was only exposed for 10 minutes to the virtual roller coaster. And then after that, that was the end of testing for the day. Group 2 on day 1 was exposed to the virtual roller coaster for 10 minutes. They had a good sizable break between the virtual roller coaster, and then they were given the tower climb study after that. Now, what we were interested in first up was how sickness would occur in exposure 3 in these 2 groups. So this group down here has had twice the exposure to virtual reality as this group. However, that second exposure is to a different app, a different game. And of course, we're also interested in how virtual tower climb relates comparing exposure 4 here to exposure 2. Now, consistent with sensory rearrangement theory, we found that the sickness induced by virtual roller coaster app was reduced on day 2 compared to day 1. However, the extra exposure to virtual climbing on day 1 did not significantly alter sickness to the virtual roller coaster on day 2. And sickness to the virtual climbing was unaffected by the amount of prior exposure to the virtual roller coaster. So based on this convergent evidence, we concluded that reductions in cyber sickness due to repeated exposure appear to be game specific. That is, the benefits that we see in one game do not necessarily generalize to another game. So this is the point where I'll summarize the findings of these 5 studies in terms of looking at the predictions of sensory conflict theory. So in looking at these studies, we see that there were some general failures to support sensory conflict theories. So low and high levels of assumed, and I'm going to put assumed there in inverted commas and stress that, low and high levels of assumed conflict did not always produce different levels of cyber sickness. We found mixed support for vection conflict theory. Some of our studies found the predicted positive relationship between vection strength and cyber sickness severity, whereas other studies did not. And we did find strong support for one core prediction of sensory rearrangement theory. Sickness did decrease with repeated exposure to the same HMD VR game, but this protection did not generalize to another HMD VR game. Okay, so that's a bunch of studies that I've done, which were designed to test the predictions of sensory conflict theory, or sensory conflict theories, should I say. But of course, sensory conflict theories don't necessarily tell us a lot about individual differences in cyber sickness. And we know that there are striking individual differences in the user experiences of cyber sickness, particularly from the last talk. And one of the hypotheses out there is that perhaps these individual differences in cyber sickness are due to individual differences in natural postural stability. Which brings me to the postural instability theory of motion sickness. This theory proposes that people who are more naturally unstable will be more susceptible to motion sickness, and that environmental conditions that increase postural instability should also increase the likelihood of motion sickness. So it's got a number of positives. It predicts that there will be individual differences in the experience of cyber sickness, which of course there are, and it can be tested using objective measures of the person's postural activity and sway. And we know everybody in this session likes objective measures. The downsides of this theory is that what constitutes postural stability and instability is currently not well understood. And so that makes examining this hypothesis a bit trickier than it otherwise would be. So I'll talk about my attempts to test the predictions of postural instability theory in HMD-VR now as well. And some of these studies you will notice overlap. Okay, so generally talking about how we measure postural instability. So we're going to measure, we have subjects stand quietly on a force plate with their eyes open or closed before they're exposed to HMD-VR. And we measure the fluctuations in their center of foot pressure continuously at about 1,000 Hertz for periods of 60 seconds along the anterior posterior and medial lateral axes. So anterior posterior is forwards backwards and medial lateral is left right. And this is a plot from our Bertec Acquire software showing that this person who's trying to stand as still as possible is actually having their center of foot pressure position moving from left to right and up and down. So this is COPY, that's the anterior posterior direction, and this is COPX, the medial lateral direction. Okay, so let's talk about some measures of positional variability that we can get from that COP data. COP data obtained during quiet stance can be used to calculate potentially useful postural activity measures. Some indices traditionally used to assess postural stability or instability are the sway path length. So here we have the anterior posterior COP position and the medial lateral COP position. We've got a plot here with eyes closed and a plot here with eyes open. If we were to take this blue trace and stretch it out into a straight line and measure the length of that straight line, that's our sway path length. Now, we can also calculate the area, the sway area, the area covered by the COP position over that same period of time, which is normally captured as a 95% confidence interval ellipse. We can see here that the sway area is larger with the eyes closed than with the eyes open. And of course, we can also calculate positional variability by just simply calculating the standard deviation of the COP over that same time period. Now, the problem with these traditional COP measures is that they don't tell us the full story. They only tell us part of the story. Sway path length, sway area, and standard deviation only tell us part of the story. And that's because the COP time series data are non-stationary. That is, they're not locally self-similar over time. So this is a locally self-similar time series plot here. If we take the mean and the standard deviation here, the mean of the standard deviation here, or here, or here, it's all going to be generally about the same. But we see over here, this is more typical of what you'd see with a COP time series plot, that the mean and the standard deviation here can be very different to the mean and the standard deviation here. So not only do we need to know about the person's positional variability, but we also need to know about the temporal dynamics of their sway. So we can examine the temporal dynamics of this sway by doing something like a trended fluctuation analysis, or one of my personal favorites, recurrence quantification analysis, but I'm not going to talk about that in this talk. Okay, so if we're doing a DFA, we're going to get information about the relative distribution of the variance across different timescales. And so over here in this plot here, we see we've got two different timescales. We've got the original timescale, and then we can zoom in to this little time window and magnify it. And then we can see how similar the standard deviations are in these original and magnified versions of the time series. So we can look at how similar the COP data are over different timescales. Basically, what we're doing is we're going to do a log of the standard deviations against a log of the window sizes. The slope of that line is DFA alpha. And so that's our index of how self-similar the COP data are over the different timescales. And if we've got an alpha of 1, that is our maximum self-similarity. If we've got an alpha greater than 0.05, then there's some correlation. But with COP time series data, we tend to find that the alpha is above 1. The data are non-stationary, they're unbounded, and they can often end up looking a bit like Brownian noise. So what we're interested in these studies are basically, can we discriminate between people who are going to become sick in HNDVR and people who are going to remain well? Can we discriminate based on their positional variability when they're standing quietly prior to the HND exposure? Or can we discriminate based on the temporal dynamics of this sway when they're trying to stand quietly? So that's what we did in these 4 different studies, and you'll see some of them overlap with the studies I've already described before. So what we're doing in these studies is we're measuring our subjects' spontaneous postural activity before they were exposed to VR, and then examining whether this spontaneous postural activity could be used to predict who would become sick and who would remain well later on. Now, each of these studies had subjects do slightly different things. So in Archioni et al., we're doing this very artificial continuous head oscillation and having the flow go in the wrong direction or the right direction or in no direction based on that head movement. In Marble Powers United, we're playing a video game in a very ecological fashion. In Rizzi and Parmisano, which I haven't mentioned before, we're just basically sliding around a futuristic rooftop in Freedom Locomotion VR. And in Clifton and Parmisano, we're doing similar things, but in a natural outdoor environment. So in each of these studies, we've got 20 minutes total exposure, up to 40 minutes total exposure to HNDVR, and we're trying to predict the occurrence of sickness in that time period. So here we can see the results of 3 of these studies. In the first of the studies, Archioni et al., we found significant differences in the sway area and standard deviation of the COP for sick and well participants before they entered HNDVR. In Teixeira and Parmisano, we found significant differences in DFA alpha for sick and well participants before they entered HNDVR. And for Rizzi and Parmisano, we again found significant differences in DFA alpha for sick and well participants before they entered HNDVR. And I should point out that in these studies, we're only focusing on the anterior-posterior axis sway, just because of statistics. We don't want to do too many statistical comparisons. So summarizing that, we find that differences between sick and well people in terms of their postural activity are represented by positional variability in this study and temporal dynamics in these 2 studies down here. But of course, I said there were 4 studies and I've only presented 3 here. What about Clifton and Parmisano? On Clifton and Parmisano, we couldn't actually test this postural instability hypothesis because of our 25 participants, Only one of them remained well throughout the study, so that didn't give us a decent control group. But we did have a second hypothesis in that study based on postural instability theory. We had hypothesized that unstable subjects might prefer teleporting over point walking. So in that study, as I've mentioned before, we found 15 subjects were steer sick. That is, they got sicker when they were point walking than teleporting. And strangely, we found 9 subjects actually got sicker when they were teleporting compared to point walking. So a significant number, 9 out of the 25 got more sick teleporting than point walking. And we see here that we can discriminate between these steer sick and tele-sick people, both in terms of the positional variability of their spontaneous postural sway and the temporal dynamics of their spontaneous postural sway. However, in this case, the discrimination is based on sway that's occurring along the medial lateral axis as opposed to the anterior posterior axis. So the left-right axis as opposed to the fore-aft axis. Okay, so that brings me to summarize the findings of these 4 different studies on postural instability theory. So summarizing these studies, we find that some studies found that subjects who later became sick displayed greater positional variability when standing quietly before entering HMDVR. That is, they had differences in their standard deviation of the COP. Other studies found that sway temporal dynamics were better at identifying which subjects would later become sick. But consistent in general with postural instability theory, all of these findings suggested that unstable people are more likely to become sick. However, the differences that we observed across these studies suggest that we're yet to identify the best or most appropriate postural indicators for cyber sickness. Ideally, these predictors or indices should always distinguish sick from well HMD users. And we found in some studies the standard deviation was the predictor. In other studies, the DFA alpha was the predictor. And in other studies, still both the standard deviation and the DFA alpha were predictors. So we're thinking that there may be a better postural predictor out there that's still to be discovered, and maybe recurrence quantification analysis might hold the key to that. Anyway, that's a story for another day. My title of my talk is Understanding Cyber Sickness in HMDVR. And so let's return to that. So our research, our earlier research based on sensory rearrangement theory and postural instability theories has had some success in improving our understanding of cyber sickness in HMDVR. However, some sensory conflict predictions were not supported, and there appears to be some variability in our postural activity findings. And we wondered, was this because our studies are based on general theories of motion sickness? That is, theories of motion sickness that have to explain air sickness, car sickness, sea sickness, simulator sickness, as well as HMDVR sickness. And we wondered whether there might be any benefits to developing a hypothesis specifically tailored for HMDVR. So that brings me to our DVP hypothesis, which I will refer to as a pragmatic approach for studying cyber sickness in HMDVR. So our DVP hypothesis was created to explain and predict the effects of display lag on cyber sickness during active HMDVR. Now, display lag is the time required for the user's tracked head movements to change the visual scene presented in their HMD, also known as motion to photon latency or end-to-end latency. So display lag is thought to be the main cause of cyber sickness in active HMDVR, when you're actually moving your head, interacting with virtual reality. But while considerable efforts have been made to reduce the average effective display lag in modern HMD systems, some still remains, and that's despite the use of asynchronous time warping and predictive tracking, etc. You're still going to have some display lag occurring from time to time. Normally, when you rotate your head, you'll be provided with consistent, that is redundant, visual and non-visual information about your head orientation. So if I move my head in this room as I'm doing now, I'm getting consistent or redundant visual and non-visual information. It's telling me the same thing about my head orientation. Now, if you make the same movement in HMDVR, display lag will result in inconsistent visual and non-visual information. And we refer to that as differences in virtual and physical head pose, which is what our DVP is. So your virtual head will often trail its true orientation and position during active HMDVR. However, importantly, this DVP will vary throughout your head movement, as can be seen in this slide here. So sometimes there's very little DVP, sometimes there is a lot. And it's this time varying aspect of DVP which we think is the killer. So we propose that large amplitude, time varying DVP is the trigger for cyber sickness, or at least the primary trigger for cyber sickness. Now, DVP often makes the world appear to swim and oscillate around you. It has actually been referred to as oscillopsia by some researchers. So oscillopsia is actually a clinical condition where, it's similar to if you're very drunk, the world will appear to swim and move around you in an illusory fashion. So we refer to that more as perceptions of scene instability. Now, we do not believe that perceptions of scene instability are essential for cyber sickness. So we think that you can get DVP from very brief latency spikes, and that'll still be provocative. That is, you don't need to be consciously aware of the DVP to get sick. However, when the DVP does reach consciousness, then learned associations between perceived scene instability and past experiences of sickness should exacerbate your symptoms. Now, furthermore, our research suggests that head rotations in yaw, pitch, and roll can all generate provocative DVP for cyber sickness. So, of course, subjective vertical conflict theory suggests that pitch and roll rotations are going to be more provocative than yaw rotations. But our research suggests that all of these head rotations are provocative, although having said that, it's very difficult to rule out if you're making a yaw head movement, there's probably going to be some small roll and pitch components to it as well. But irrespective, in each of these cases, the DVP will increase and become more variable when additional display lag is injected into the system. So the more lag you have, the more DVP you're going to have. And the faster your head is moving, the more DVP you're going to have as well. So therefore, increases in display lag and increases in head speed should both increase the likelihood and severity of cyber sickness, according to our DVP hypothesis. Okay, so that brings me to my first of my new studies, testing the DVP hypothesis for pitch head rotations. So in this case, we're making pitch head rotations, continuous oscillatory pitch head rotations, and we're viewing this very exciting Tron-like room with various levels of display lag added to it. So this study is Kim, Liu, and Parmesano. And in the study, we had 30 participants make continuous pitch head movements while viewing this virtual room through an Oculus Rift HMD. On different trials, we examined the effects of artificially imposing additional constant lags ranging from 0 to 200 milliseconds on top of a very low baseline system lag of 4 milliseconds. Participants timed their head movements to a computer-generated metronome, so they either made a slow head movement at 0.5 Hertz or a fast head movement at 1 Hertz. And sickness severity was measured for each trial using the fast motion sickness scale, ranging from well to frank sickness. And we also used the SSQ as well to figure out what the symptom profile looked like on each case. Now, the important thing about this study is that we artificially imposed lag on top of the system, and we did that in a systematic fashion. So basically, head pose data was sampled on every frame and written to a circular memory array of element length n. And small constant increases in display lag could therefore be produced by increasing the element length n for that trial. So if we chose an n of 1, there would be no additional display lag. We'd only have the baseline of, on average, 4 millisecond lag. If we chose an n of 18, then there would be an extra delay of 18 frames on top of that baseline lag. So approximately 200 milliseconds of imposed lag on top of the approximate 4 milliseconds of baseline lag. Okay, so here are some results from the study. Consistent with our DVP hypothesis, cyber sickness severity increased with the level of constant display lag during pitch head rotations. So as the display lag increased from 0 to 200 milliseconds of added lag, we got greater cyber sickness. And that cyber sickness was more severe with the faster head movements than with the slower head movements. Now, that's only indirectly testing the DVP hypothesis. What we need to do to directly test the DVP hypothesis is to figure out how much DVP the head speed and the display lag was actually producing. So in the study, DVP was estimated using the participants' own pitch head orientation data for that trial. So here we have the raw trace coming from the Oculus Rift HMD we've got the head orientation in pitch, which obviously has a larger amplitude than the head orientations in roll or yaw. Now we're going to ignore roll and yaw and just focus on the pitch. So we know the display lag for the trial because we experimentally created it. So we treat the display lag for the trial as the temporal offset between the time of writing to and the time of reading from the circular memory array, i.e. it is n frames. So taking the information that we have about the participants' physical head orientation throughout the trial and that information about the experimentally imposed display lag, we can calculate the virtual head orientation throughout the trial, as well as the physical head orientation throughout the trial. And then we will calculate the DVP as the difference between the physical and the virtual traces. That'll give us the signed DVP time series data. And then simply we rectify that signed DVP time series data to give us the unsigned DVP time series data. Now, consistent with our DVP hypothesis, we found strong positive linear relationships between sickness severity and the mean unsigned DVP, sickness severity and the peak DVP, and sickness severity and the standard deviation of the DVP. So as the mean DVP increases, or the peak DVP increases, or the standard deviation of the DVP increases, so too does the cyber sickness severity. And we can see from these plots that we're accounting for about 95 to 97% of the variance in cyber sickness severity based on these DVP indices. However, I should point that these plots are for illustration purposes only. What they're showing is the mean of the mean unsigned DVP, the mean of the peak DVP, and the mean of the standard deviation of the DVP compared to the mean FMS scores or cyber sickness severity scores. So for statistical testing, what we actually did was we plotted the DVP index for the subject. So this is the DVP on each of the trials for the subject against their cyber sickness scores for that trial. We found the line of best fit, got the slope of that line of best fit, and put that over here. And then we got the slopes of the lines of best fits for all of the subjects. And we basically tested whether those slopes were significantly different to zero, and rather more that they were significantly positive, because we're expecting a significant positive relationship between DVP and FMS, which is of course what we're finding here. So all the results I'm going to talk to you about today from these studies are very highly significant, and the significance is determined in this fashion. Okay, so that's our first study looking exclusively at pitch head rotations. This study is looking at yaw head rotations. So we're making continuous oscillatory yaw head rotations, and we're adding various levels of display lag into the simulation, and we're having participants make those head movements at fast and slow speeds. So the same virtual environment, and here we have the display lag and head speed data. So we can see that again, cyber sickness severity increases with the display lag from no added display lag to approximately 200 milliseconds of added display lag. There's only really a trend for the head speed to have an effect in this particular case, but the sample size was lower in this study than in the previous one. But again, what we're interested in looking at is the actual DVP. So in this case, we're calculating the DVP by looking at the recorded head orientation data in the yaw axis. In the previous study, we only looked at the head orientation data from the pitch axis. Because we're making yaw head movements in this study, we're only looking at yaw at this time. So again, consistent with our DVP hypothesis, we found strong positive linear relationships between cyber sickness severity and the mean unsigned DVP, between cyber sickness severity and the peak DVP, and between cyber sickness severity and the standard deviation of the DVP. And the last study I'm going to talk about is again testing the DVP hypothesis, but this time for all of the different types of head rotation that we can make. So looking at pitch head rotation, like in the Kim et al. Study, looking at yaw head rotation, as in the Parmesano et al. 2019 study, and now looking also at roll head rotation on top of that. So the design again is very similar. We've got 21 participants making continuous head rotations about one axis while viewing the same virtual room and under the same display lag conditions. So as I said, you either rotate your head in yaw or you rotate it in pitch, or you rotate in roll, which is the new axis we're looking at. So we're replicating and extending the previous studies that we've done. In each particular trial, the DVP was estimated using the head orientation data only along that axis that the person is supposed to be moving their head along. Okay, so here is the relationship between display lag and cyber sickness severity for the 3 different types of head rotation and at the 2 different types of head speed. And we can see that as display lag increased, we get increases in cyber sickness severity that are pretty similar for all of the different types of head rotation. So maybe yaw is a bit less than roll and pitch, but it's not a huge deal, particularly at the faster head speeds. Now, consistent with our DVP hypothesis, we again found strong positive linear relationships between cyber sickness severity and the mean unsigned DVP for all types of head rotation. So we can see here that we're explaining somewhere between 90% of the variance in the cyber sickness severity and 46% of the variance in the cyber sickness severity based on the mean DVP. So prediction is not quite as good for roll head rotations as it is for pitch and yaw head rotations using the mean DVP, but it's still highly significant. We also found strong positive linear relationships between sickness severity and peak DVP for all 3 types of head rotation, including roll. So here we're explaining 62% of the variance in the cyber sickness severity and up to 94% of the variance in the cyber sickness severity based on the peak DVP. And finally, we found strong positive linear relationships between sickness severity and the standard deviation of the DVP during all 3 types of head rotation, including roll. But in this case, we're getting really good prediction for roll head rotation based on the standard deviation of the DVP. Okay, so that's my data brought to an end. What I want to now do is talk about some explanations and predictions based on the DVP hypothesis. So we would argue that DVP explains why sickness is more severe in HMDs. So if we look at other types of virtual reality, so non-HMD based virtual reality, when you move your head in a cave, you will get the expected visual motion immediately. And that's because the expected visual motion that you're getting is being produced by your physical head motion relative to the earth fixed displays. But when you're in an HMD and make a head rotation, the displays move with you. So all of the expected visual motion has to be computer generated, and therefore it has some delay, it has some display lag. So we would argue that HMD VR is more provocative for sickness because it generates some as opposed to no lag-based DVP. Now, our theory is specifically designed to explain cyber sickness during active HMD VR, but it can also be used to explain sickness during passive HMD VR as well. So a situation where you're experiencing an illusion of self-motion or vection while viewing a first-person simulation of a roller coaster ride. So if you're seated with your head on chin rest and you're viewing this roller coaster simulation, you will still get DVP. And the reason you will get DVP is because you are getting visually simulated self-motion and there is no non-visual cues that support that simulation. So this vection-based DVP would be expected to increase the likelihood of visually induced sickness in susceptible users. But unlike vection conflict theory, we don't say that all vection is bad. We say that the DVP, the vection-based DVP, has to be large magnitude and time-varying vection. Okay, so if you're traveling at a constant linear direction, there's no acceleration, then you shouldn't have a problem. But if you're on a roller coaster ride, you will be getting time-varying DVP, time-varying vection, and that will be problematic. Now, of course, if you view that roller coaster ride while you're standing up, then you're going to have vection-based DVP and display lag-based DVP occurring, because when you're standing up, you will make involuntary head movements and you'll sway backwards and forwards. Those head movements and that sway will interact with the simulation, and the display lag will cause there to be DVP due to display lag. So you will get vection-based DVP plus display lag-based DVP, and you're going to get more DVP and therefore more likely to become sick. So the main predictions of our DVP hypothesis are as follows. Movement and simulation conditions that increase the DVP or make it more variable should increase the likelihood and severity of cyber sickness. In active HMD VR, you should be less tolerant to display lag when you make faster head movements. and you'll be more likely to become sick when you're standing and unrestrained. However, you can still get provocative DVP, you can still get sick when you're physically stationary and exposed to minimal display lag. Even if the system has been optimized so that there's hardly any lag, you can still get provocative DVP if you're experiencing large magnitude time varying vection, or if there are movement calibration errors. Say there's an error in the tracking or the gain is off. These could all produce provocative DVP. So one bit of potential good news is that head rotations may be more important than other types of movements that you might make in virtual reality, which also relates to something I heard in the previous talk. So we also predict that display lag will be more provocative for cyber sickness during head rotations compared to head translation. So a rotation is where you're changing the orientation of the head. A translation is where you're changing the position of your head. So if I change my position of my head like this in the real world, what I'll normally get is referred to as motion parallax. So something that's nearer to me will appear to move further and faster than something that's further away. If I rotate my head, everything moves at the same speed. And so we've not only got the fact that our inner ear appears to be more sensitive to self-generated head rotations than self-generated head translations, but we've also got the fact that visual changes during head rotations are easier to detect than visual changes during self-translations or changes in head position. Consistent with this proposal, we've found some evidence that HMD users are more tolerant to display lag and DVP during linear head movements as opposed to angular head movements. And end up by relating DVP to other theories and other well-known findings. So I'll first say what I think might be a good thing about the DVP hypothesis. So sensory conflict theories have been criticized for many years for being difficult to test. And one of the reasons they're difficult to test is that you have to assume that there's sensory conflict occurring and that there's a certain amount of sensory conflict occurring. So with the DVP hypothesis, the way that we've tested it and created it, instead of merely speculating about the presence or degree of sensory conflict in a particular simulation, our approach actually quantifies the amount of DVP produced during each active exposure to HMDVR. Based on how much display lag there is and how fast your head is moving, we can figure out how much sensory conflict you should be experiencing. And this DVP is an objective measure of the stimulation. It's not an internal model of the user's sensory processing. Another potential advantage of DVP is that it might provide a simpler operational definition of the provocative stimulation for cyber sickness during active HMDVR. So postural instability's got a lot of positives about it, but one of the issues with it is it's very difficult to figure out what postural stability or instability is. And part of the complication is that it's not just the person's head that's being looked at, but it's their entire body and their limbs. The DVP hypothesis is focused only on the user's head movements. And so therefore it makes it comparatively a bit easier to figure out whether the DVP might be provocative or not than whether the person is posturally unstable or not. Now, how do we explain adaptation to cyber sickness? Well, we don't have a specific mechanism to explain adaptation or habituation to cyber sickness in HMDVR. But if DVP is treated as a sensory conflict involving head pose, then adaptation could be explained in terms of neural mismatch and sensory rearrangement as per Reason's 1978 theory. So on first entering VR, users are more likely to become sick because they expect multisensory stimulation that they would normally experience in the real world, but instead they're getting DVP. With repeated exposure to HMDVR, users will become recalibrated to the DVP due to display lag and get less neural mismatch over time and less sickness on each subsequent exposure. Now, this sort of idea predicts that there's some light at the end of the tunnel if the display lag is a constant display lag or a periodic display lag, but we're not so sure that there's good news if the DVP produced by random latency spikes is provocative. And there is evidence that DVP produced by random latency spikes is provocative in some recent studies. How do we explain individual differences in cyber sickness based on DVP? Well, again, we don't have a specific mechanism to explain individual differences in cyber sickness based on DVP, but our DVP hypothesis is potentially compatible with the postural instability theory. So we propose that preconscious pickup of large amplitude time-varying DVP indicates that our head is unstable, and that triggers automatic postural activity, which therefore increases the likelihood of becoming posturally unstable and sick. And individual differences in natural stability could then interact with those automatic postural responses, and that would determine how likely one is to become sick or remain well. And this is my last slide, or second last slide, which is good news, I guess. What do we need to do in the future with DVP? Well, future research will need to determine the exact nature of the provocative DVP for cyber sickness onset. In the studies that I've talked about today, we've looked at the relationship between DVP indices and cyber sickness severity, but we haven't looked at what is happening in terms of the temporal dynamics of the DVP around the time the person first gets sick. And so we need to do more fine-grained studies to look at what exactly is the provocative nature of the DVP. But I would argue, based on the fact that standard deviation of the DVP is very good at predicting cyber sickness severity, that time-varying large amplitude DVP does seem to be a good candidate. Now, the DVP that we've looked at so far has been artificially created or exacerbated by imposing constant display lags into the system. But of course, that's not what normally happens in well, this case, the real world, but the real world testing virtual reality. What we normally get when we're playing virtual reality or interacting with VR apps is time-varying display lag. And so we need to do some experimental manipulations that involve time-varying display lag and see how that affects DVP and cyber sickness. Now, another thing we need to do is we need to see whether our DVP-based predictions generalize to free naturalistic head movements. So the sorts of head movements that you normally make when you're playing a video game naturally. So the head movements that we've examined so far are these continuous oscillatory head movements. We don't do that in video games or in VR apps normally. So obviously we're trying to ramp up the sickness production to 11 by doing these sorts of studies, by really making the display lag more salient and powerful. But we need to look at more realistic head movements as well, something like a visual search task or something that you might normally be asked to do in a VR game, and see how that affects DVP and cyber sickness. Another thing we need to do is look at how it's best to calculate the DVP. So in the studies that I've talked to you about today, I've talked about asking people to move their heads about a particular axis and then just looking at the DVP along that particular axis. But the DVP in reality will involve head rotations and head translations in 6 degrees of freedom. So we're only looking at one axis in our DVP calculations so far. There may be more sophisticated DVP calculations that we should be doing, and that might further improve the predictive ability of DVP. And of course, once we've done all of that, and we know everything we need to know about DVP, we need to look at how that DVP can be used to mitigate cyber sickness in HMV VR. So we could measure the DVP in certain experimental conditions and extrapolate the likelihood of sickness and the severity of sickness that people might experience in those conditions in the future. We could measure DVP in real time and provide users with real-time warnings that they're making provocative head movements. We might look at DVP in games that we're creating and see that we need to rescript those games to sort of intermix periods of really high active motion with more calm sort of periods as well. But the important thing about DVP is because we can quantify the sensory conflict experiences that people are experiencing, we can then use that quantifiable information to inform what we're actually doing in VR. And I shall end it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that talk. Very, very like a fire hose of information.
That's what I'm like at 6 o'clock in the morning.
So we have a number of questions on the Discord, and one that I know a lot of us are probably wondering is your software that quantifies postural sway or DVP available online?
So all the stuff we're doing is after the fact. So we're recording the head movement. Well, Oculus is kindly recording the head orientations for us. And then we're running custom R or MATLAB software afterwards to process that. If you're talking about the DFA software, for the trended fluctuation analysis or anything like that. There's plenty of free toolboxes out there that are just as good as ours. We're happy to make ours available. In terms of the R code that we've got for calculating DVP, yeah, sure, that's fine. We can make that available too. Yeah, and I did mention RQA a few times, recurrence quantification analysis. There's some really excellent toolbox on recurrence quantification analysis, and I would really highly recommend people have a look at RQA. DFA, so in all of our studies thus far, that I'm reporting here, there are some other studies I have where we've used RQA instead. In all the studies that I've reported here on postural sway, I've consistently used the standard deviation of the COP and the DFA alpha value. And the reason that we've done that is because we really wanted to restrict the number of predictors that we could use in these studies, because we have problems in research that if you have too many predictors, then one of them is going to be significant just by chance. And so this is a good way of narrowing it down. We've got one predictor based on positional variability and one predictor based on temporal dynamics. But if you look at recurrence quantification analysis, there are so many intriguing and interesting predictors. It's very fruitful in an exploratory sense, but we need to whittle down which are the really key predictors that we need to look at. So while I've been a bit down on postural instability theory in the talk, I don't feel that way. I think there's lots of potential there, but we do have this problem with trying to figure out exactly what is postural stability and what is postural stability. How do we determine that? What are the exact indices that we need to look at? And I've got a couple of other papers where I've played around with this, but you have to be very careful. If you have many predictors, there's so much variability in the postural instability data and the DVP data that you very quickly get to a point where things might be just becoming significant just by chance.
Okay, gosh, we've got so many questions. It's hard to know which one. I'm just going to do these in random order. So sorry, not first come, first serve. So Jason Gerald had a really interesting question, which had to do with the subjective experience of latency. So like if there's latency but people don't notice it, for example, is that different than if there's objective latency, you know, and if there's the same amount of objective latency but a different subjective experience of that objective latency, does that make a difference? I hope I'm getting your question right.
Yeah, I think so. So subjectively, of course, there's a difference because you're either perceiving the DVP or not. So the problem is, studies have looked at what is the threshold, what is the minimum display lag that people can just detect, and the problem is that that's what we can consciously detect. And I'm a perception researcher, that's my background. Now, of course, perception research has often ignored vection and treated it very poorly, which is a pity because I love vection. But vection is a conscious experience of self-motion, and most self-motion researchers don't think that a conscious experience of self-motion is important at all. They think that all of the important information that we have about self-motion that we use to control our self-motion is extracted subconsciously or pre-consciously. And so in the same way, the DVP could be provocative. It could cause real problems, even though we don't actually detect it. And I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Stalford has done a number of papers looking at latency spikes that are undetectable to the observers. But if you have a condition with added latency spikes versus a condition without those added latency spikes, you find that people get sicker with the added latency spikes, even though they can't detect them. They're very short latency. So that's a real problem for us. But what we're saying in our theory is that if you do consciously perceive the DVP, then it's going to be worse. And it's going to be worse because you're not only subconsciously, pre-consciously processing it and triggering the sickness, but you've also got classical conditioning involved as well. If you've been out on the booze and you've got a bit drunk, then you'll get oscillopsia, which I'm talking about before, or perceived scene instability. You should be familiar with that. And of course, your experiences with that perceived scene instability have not gone well. They might have involved some trips to the bathroom, some out-of-stomach experiences, whatever. And so the classical conditioning association with those conscious experiences of DVP will be on top of whatever else is there pre-consciously.
Thank you. So let's see, so some more questions. Let's see, Elka Fulmer, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, was wondering if there are any longitudinal studies that have looked at, because you talked about some studies that you've done looking about the effect of exposure. And but Elka was wondering about some longitudinal studies about repeated exposure over days, weeks, months to cyber sickness in headsets. So you had said that in your work you didn't find a generalization from one type of exposure to another, and I think this was a follow-up question on that.
Not that we've done ourselves. There's some really good research, I think, by Howarth and Hill back in the day, maybe in the 1990s. And I know there are other studies, but it's early in the morning. I can't remember their names at the moment, but certainly there have been studies that have, I think maybe Regan has looked over very long time periods, so over months. And so there is good evidence of habituation for much longer periods. And in fact, if anything, our study is a very short period, and we may not have found habituation or adaptation over a 24-hour period, but we appear to have, which is great, because otherwise it'd be a bit of a loss. But importantly, these previous studies that have looked at longitudinal effects have, of course, all used the same stimuli repeatedly. And so they suffer from the same problems that we've got here. So their findings, we do find that there is adaptation, habituation to cyber sickness, but previously these studies have really all focused on the same sort of stimulus. Now, of course, if we've got a reduction in cyber sickness, there are multiple causes for that reduction in cyber sickness, and I haven't quite worked all this through my head yet, because I'm not, while I'm a psychologist, I'm not a learning psychologist. But there are a number of ways that we could adapt to these stimuli. There's behavioral adaptation. So if I'm in VR and I find moving my head is provocative for cyber sickness, then I might adapt to that cyber sickness by just not moving my head as much, or changing the way that I move my head and restricting movements. So there's behavioral adaptation. Then there is sensory adaptation, that I get used to let's say the optic flow, if we think that's a problem, that I generally get desensitized to the optic flow, or to the sensory conflict between the presence of optic flow and the absence of information in my inner ear. Sorry, we have power saving. I have to move more. So I could get desensitized to the sensory conflict, or it might be habituation. And habituation is known to be stimulus specific, and it could also be a learning-based phenomenon as well.
Wow. So let's see. So Bobby Bodenheimer was wondering if you can talk about work where if immobilizing the user's head leads to not perceiving cyber sickness.
Well, as I said, immobilizing the head won't get rid of DBP. So if the simulation is an accelerating simulation, and I think the previous talk talked about how rotation was particularly provocative. Now, rotation, even if it's a constant velocity rotation, is still an acceleration because the direction is changing. So the problem is, even if your head is physically still and you've restrained it, and you don't really want to do that in VR, because the whole point of HMD VR is that you can explore the environment. Even if your head is perfectly still and perfectly restrained and kept aligned perfectly with vertical, I haven't talked about subjective vertical conflict theory in these studies, mostly because I haven't really tested it, because the head's, I tell people to move the head a certain way, but they would still move it in these other axes as well. So I don't think these are strong tests of subjective vertical conflict theory. But one of the other big theories, other big sensory conflict theories, is that you need to keep your head aligned to vertical. So the head's still and perfectly aligned with vertical. According to those theories, you shouldn't get sick at all. But we're arguing in our theory that you will, if there is accelerating self-motion. If you're viewing a virtual roller coaster ride, then you're going to get large amplitude, time varying DBP, and you're still going to get sick. You might not get as sick as if you're standing freely and also swaying and moving your head in response to it, because then you're getting DVP, delay-based DVP on top of vection-based DVP, and that's all adding up. And the more DVP you've got, the more likely you are to get sick.
So that leads to as a nice segue into the next question, again by Dr. Frommer, asking about if there's any relationship that you've noticed between cyber sickness and vestibular dysfunction. So people who have vestibular dysfunction, you know, for maybe they're older and they, you know, they have some sort of either older or there's some sort of vestibular dysfunction, if they would be more tendency to cyber sickness than without, or how vestibular dysfunction might relate to cyber sickness.
Okay, right. Well, I haven't exactly tested that per se. I have done lots of these things in terms of vection. And of course, many of the observations in the literature are that you can't get cyber sick without functioning vestibular systems. So that if you were to completely remove or destroy the vestibular system of an individual, it's argued that they can't become sick. So there's certain research by Bob Chung and I think Ken Money, who have shown that if you remove the inner ears of animals, or if you've got somebody who's had bilateral labyrinthine removals, that those people don't vomit. Now, vomiting is not necessarily the same thing as not being sick. It's obviously, people in this session will love it because it's an objective measure. And I will point out that we have just had to complete an incident report last week because we did have a case of vomiting from HMDVR. So it is relatively rare. About 1 to 2% of people will get it. Less than that in my lab, but it does happen. And I will also say that I dabble in other areas of research, and I've done some microgravity parabola flights in that research. And I would say that I've got as sick in HMD-based virtual reality as I have got in those parabola flights. Certainly, I've sweated through my shirt as much as I have in those flights. So there's certainly a large vestibular component. Now, in the studies that we do in my lab, we're always testing vestibulally healthy individuals, because I think the idea is that the research we're doing is going to help HMD gamers who tend to be, you know, skewed towards being younger, healthier people, certainly than I am. And so they're really the target audience that we're aimed at. But having said that, if you've got your vestibular system removed surgically, then you shouldn't be experiencing the sickness based on the literature that I've read.
Thank you. So Farron Argalege was asking about the potential role of this vestibular ocular reflex in VR sickness, and if you've explored those effects in your studies.
Not directly, although the theory is informed by that. So, we're arguing that that head rotation should be more provocative than head translation, so that angular changes in head orientation are going to be more provocative than linear changes in head position. And the reason that we're arguing that is based on the vestibular system and what we know about its sensitivity. So what we know about the sensitivity of the vestibular system in part comes from our knowledge of vestibulally driven compensatory eye movements. We know that the latencies for head rotation based eye movements are shorter than the latencies for head translation based eye movements. So that suggests that head rotation should be more provocative than head translations based on the differences in the sensitivity of the semicircular canals versus the otolith organs.
Okay, that was, you got some claps for that answer.
Well, I should say what we've done here is we've just sort of stuck ourselves out there. I've spent most of my career not making a theory. And one of the criticisms of many of the theories in motion sickness is that they're very difficult to test. So the DVP hypothesis is tailored just to this specific situation of cyber sickness in HMDVR. And we stuck out a whole bunch of hypotheses that people can test and show that we're wrong. And if we're wrong, I'll lump it. But we've just decided let's have some hypotheses, and it's something that then can be tested and can move science a bit forward. Maybe we're wrong, maybe we're disproved, but we've got something that we can test and figure out whether this is what's happening or not.
So let's see, but there's another question in the Discord from Tiago Maleros, asking if you think that the DVP issues have different rates between the central and the peripheral visual areas, if there's anything sort of yeah.
Well, as you read in my introduction, my honours thesis back in the Pleistocene period was looking at visual self-motion perception in central and peripheral vision. And there are a lot of misconceptions about self-motion perception. So for a long time, there was an idea that there was a peripheral dominance for vection, for self-motion perception, that you'd only get vection from stimulating the periphery of the visual field, and that you only got object motion perception in the center of the visual field. So that prejudice has been out there for a long time, and it's actually been disproved by a number of studies that show that if the amount of optic flow is the same in any of these locations, you get the same amount of vection. Now, of course, vection is not the same thing as cyber sickness, but you can sort of see how some of those misconceptions with vection and illusions of self-motion and motion perception can sort of conflate and appear in sickness research as well. So in general, in the vection literature, the larger the motion stimulation you have, the more powerful the visual illusion of self-motion is. It doesn't matter whether it's in the central vision or in the peripheral vision. There doesn't seem to be a really qualitative difference in those studies, although we have just done a study. I said we haven't looked at any clinical cases with vestibular, but I'm a vision researcher, so we tend to focus on vision researchers. We have looked at self-motion perception and cyber sickness in a new study in investigative ophthalmology and visual science, and have found some very interesting effects in terms of cyber sickness in HMDs with people with clinical conditions such as glaucoma and macular degeneration. So loss of visual perception in the central visual field or in the periphery. And so I would encourage you to have a look at some of those studies if you're interested in visual field dependence and the relationship with cyber sickness. There are some effects, and they are interesting effects, and there are also some effects on presence as well.
So Ritaful Islam, who gave the talk about the machine learning, is wondering if you have made any of your raw data available online, if there's any repositories of collected data that others might be able to learn from.
We've provided open access data that we've done our analyses on, but not on the raw data per se. So we don't have any problems with providing that. But at the moment, we've only got the data that we've analysed, not the stuff that we've had to pre-process and then compile, because obviously that's a very large data set, and we're only simple psychologists. We need somewhere to put that data, but we don't have any objection to providing that if people are interested.
Okay, so to be clear, he didn't ask if it was the raw data. He just said, is the data available?
Well, data is available, but probably what he would like is the raw traces of the COP data and the raw traces of the head orientation data, and then maybe the calculated traces of the DVP. And of course, we're very interested in people studying and playing around with that with machine learning and figuring out what they can figure out. But yeah, no, we won't have that online anywhere currently, but we could make that available, just very large data sets. So 1,000 hertz samples over long periods. And then, of course, one of the things we are moving into in the lab is looking at postural activity in real time while we're measuring head position data. And I've just done everything involved in coding all of that so that we're getting the head orientation in 6 degrees of freedom and the COP data in real time as well. And obviously those are going to produce very large data sets, which might be of interest to people who are interested in modeling and machine learning and such things.
So Stephen Gilbert has posted to the Discord a link to something called Open Science Framework, which I guess would be a data repository for things like that. It's osf.io. also an easy URL to remember.
I think it's more a factor for us trying to figure out how to code that, label it so that other people can make sense of it. Obviously, that's a fair bit of work when you've got such large data sets from individuals, and so having to store that in a way that other people could make sense of and use is yeah, something that we're not familiar with.
Well, thank you so much again for this really, really inspiring talk. It's well, it's 7, 9, whatever, 45. So I think we need to stop here. And I will turn it back over to Evan Sumer Rosenberg for the wrap up. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. All right, so I really don't have a lot of comments to make. Thank you all for a very lively discussion. I think this is one of the best discussions that we've had at WISP so far. And Vicky, do you have any comments you'd like to make to close out the workshop?
No, you know what we could do if people are okay, we could let folks chat on the Zoom if people are interested. I don't know that I got everybody. I might have mangled a bunch of people's questions. So if people have other questions for Steve, that's the only thing I can think of.
I'll come back.
Yeah, so we have, I don't think, yeah, so officially we have scheduled another 15 minutes opened. So if anyone has more questions for Steve or wants to ask them even live on Zoom, feel free. But other than that, I'll just get out of the way now and just say thank you everyone for attending. And then hopefully we will be able to see all of you in person next year for the 4th WISP workshop. Right.
Yeah, thank you again.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for your talk.
No problem.
I have a question. So, yeah, if I'm understanding DVP correctly, which may be an invalid assumption, but if I am, it's basically head displacement over time. Is that correct?
Well, displacement sounds like it's translation. So 6 degrees of freedom, we've got positional changes and orientation-based changes. So we're arguing that the orientation-based changes might be worse than the displacement changes.
Sure. Okay, so the angular offset. Yeah, so so I had the question about the subjective sort of, if you notice it, you still might get sick. So that's very interesting. So when I was running studies, this was purely on the perception side, not on the do you get sick side. So that's very interesting to me how they might or might not relate. I've sort of always wondered about that, but haven't had a chance to investigate it. One participant had a just noticeable difference of 3.2 milliseconds, right, which was pretty much superhuman, better than I could do. Another one, I had to throw out their data because they couldn't detect it, all the way up to 300 milliseconds. No matter what I did, they just couldn't detect it. So, I suspect that 300 millisecond person might have gotten sick, right, even if they didn't notice it. But that'd be interesting to follow up on. But yeah, in regards to the DVP, what I looked at specifically was a little bit different, similar because it was head yaws like you do. But I was looking at these perceptual thresholds as a function of peak head acceleration, right? So the faster you move versus just, and it was angles, not translation in this case.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, given that the vestibular system senses angular velocity and acceleration, what are your thoughts on looking at sickness as a measure of head velocity and head acceleration versus angular displacement?
Sorry, I'm a bit confused about that. It sounded like we're using sickness to measure head speed, which probably the other way around, isn't it?
Yeah, I would definitely think the other way around.
Yeah, because
although that would be an interesting way as well.
Yeah, no, look, in terms of DVP, head speed and head acceleration is a big deal. So it's you don't get display lag based DVP without the head movement. And the greater the acceleration, the more the DVP you're going to get. So that would explain why certain types of head movements are more provocative than other types of head movements when they're interacting with the display lag. So not only are we talking about the trajectory of the head movement, whether it's linear or angular, or whether it's in yaw, pitch, or roll, or X, Y, and Z, but it's also how that head movement is moving. What acceleration profile does it have? Is it accelerating, decelerating, that sort of stuff? So I mean, the issue with DVP, I mean, for a long time, sensory conflict theories has all been about this visual vestibular conflict, and it was pointed out correctly today, somatosensory conflict as well. You know, neck proprioception, for example, is also in the mix when you're moving your head, so that you will detect your head movement based on your neck muscle receptors, etc. So there's more than just the visual vestibular system involved as well. But why some people have thought our theory is not particularly new or interesting is because they sort of go, this is what we always thought with sensory conflict theory. But the difference with DVP and sensory conflict theory is we're actually trying to quantify what the conflict is. So the DVP is an estimate of what that conflict is. It's a numerical estimate, which we can then say that condition had more DVP than that other condition, therefore it should have been more provocative. And so we can calculate that DVP based on our knowledge of the head position and orientation over time, plus the display lag that we're imposing on top of the system. Yeah. So if you did those studies with the different acceleration profiles, and you also experimentally imposed lag on top of it, then you could manipulate the DVP in multiple different ways.
Yeah, certainly a lot of things to think about there. Thank you.
No problem.
Not sure if the channel is still live on Verbella or not, but I think we're probably pretty much over. So thank you again, Steve, so much for this, and I'll send you instructions on how to next steps for the that we discussed earlier. For the
okay, sure thing. All right, I will see you then.